What if the Church never dreaded monsters because it crafted them? Not tales, not myths, not curses, but doctrine hidden in steel and secrecy. For ages, we've been told werewolves are folklore, men transformed under moonlight, consumed by fury. But what if the reality was more sinister? What if one still lingers beneath Rome? Not because God couldn't end him, but because the Vatican refuses to let him perish. What would you do if your beliefs led you to a creature bound by sacred chants, its eyes still shedding human tears? Would you aid him or hush him once more? Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient stories, buried terrors, and supernatural conflicts awaken. If you're captivated by the hidden facets of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell below to stay updated with every epic tale. Father Carlos arrived at the Vatican with more than luggage. He carried a legacy. A scholar from Spain, renowned for his expertise in theological history, he had earned a rare fellowship to explore the Church's core. From the moment he passed through Vatican City's grand gates, the air felt heavy, not with sanctity, but with centuries of guarded whispers. Despite the language divide, Carlos adapted swiftly. He earned respect, gaining entry to exclusive libraries and obscure archives. Yet, even in this sacred place, there were passages where silence lingered too long and doors that remained locked. In those shadows, Carlos first caught murmurs, whispers in Latin and soft Italian, about hidden sublevels beneath the archives, places even cardinals dared not name. With each week, the enigma deepened. His access within the Vatican grew, as did his fixation. One night, curiosity drew him downward, past stone chapels and icy reliquaries. The deeper he descended, the more the world above faded. The air grew thick. The silence became eerie. Then he found the corridor, long, unmarked, untouched by time or intent. At its end, a cell, its ancient iron bars half-eaten by rust. Carlos froze. This was no mere relic of confinement. Behind the bars, something stirred. A deep, guttural moan echoed, followed by a sound that defied description, a rasping sob, not entirely human. He stepped closer, peering into the gloom. A figure crouched in the corner, breathing, watching. The air turned sharp, his skin tingled, and before he could grasp what he saw, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. He turned. A tall man in dark robes stood behind him, his face stern, his voice like distant thunder. "You shouldn't be here, Father," he said. "What you found. Forget it." The man guided Carlos to a chamber without windows. Candles flickered. Silence stretched for long moments. Then the stranger sighed. "What's in that cell isn't human. Not anymore." Stunned, Carlos whispered, "I heard it." It sounded alive, in pain. "He was once a man," the stranger said. "Long ago, before the Inquisition, something possessed him, not just inhabited, but consumed him. The body and demon merged. What emerged was neither man nor beast." Carlos leaned in, struggling to process the words. "He became something we couldn't purge. Our prayers were useless. Holy water evaporated. Crucifixes warped in our grip. We couldn't destroy him. We could only confine him." The silence that followed was heavy, unyielding. The stranger introduced himself as Allergo. "He's been imprisoned for centuries. Never aging, never dying. He knows only pain, hunger, and rage." Carlos's voice quivered. "So, he's immortal?" "Not quite," Allergo replied. "He can be injured, but he always recovers. The chains we made barely restrain him now. He's growing stronger." Carlos's mind reeled. Why has this been hidden? Allerjo's smile was grim. Some legends are truths softened by time. What you saw is the first, perhaps the last. A remnant of a failed sacred experiment. Carlos blinked. What experiment? Allerjo hesitated, then spoke. Long ago, some in the church believed the only way to combat evil was to harness it. Non demonium venit de inferis set up intra ecclesia. The demon didn't rise from hell but from within the church. Codex Umber, 1387. The revelation hit Carlos like a strike. You created him. We sought to understand evil, to control possession, to forge something to stand against demonic forces. But we birthed something else, a hybrid. It couldn't be tamed, only entombed. The weight of this truth shook Carlos to his core. And you kept it hidden. We had no choice, Allerjo said. If the world learned what we couldn't control, what we made, it would shatter more than the church. Carlos met Allerjo's gaze. Why tell me? Because you saw him, Allerjo paused, and because we need help. We've failed. The wards weaken. The old symbols fade. The iron decays. If he breaks free, nothing can prepare the world for what follows. Carlos stood, his breath uneven. He had come to study history. Instead, he uncovered a living sin, a theology of flesh and claws buried beneath Rome. I need to see him again. Allerjo's eyes widened. That's madness. Carlos shook his head. If there's any humanity left in him, I must know. Hours later, he stood before the cell again. The iron door was still sealed, but the air felt different, charged as if the thing inside could sense his return. Carlos took a trembling step forward. Do you understand me? He asked, voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. Silence, then a whisper, dry, ragged. Help me. Carlos staggered back. Behind the bars, the shape shifted, moved forward. Eyes like molten silver met his, part man, part beast, and fully aware. I was once a man, it said. I was betrayed. Carlos couldn't breathe. By who? The reply was a growl of grief. The church. Those who called themselves shepherds carved the beast in my flesh and called it salvation. Fragmentum Tenebra, Vatican Archive B17. Allerjo, watching from behind, looked horrified. That's not possible. It is, Carlos muttered. And if it's true, what else have they hidden? The creature spoke again. You can free me. Carlos clenched his fists. The choice before him was impossible, trust the Vatican or trust the thing they buried. Either way, the world would change. He turned to Allerjo. I want the truth. All of it. Allerjo hesitated, then nodded. Then follow me, Father. There is more you must see. And deep in the dark, behind the rusting bars, the creature watched them go, silent, patient, knowing for the first time in centuries, someone had listened. Carlos stood motionless as Allerjo laid the first parchment before him. The paper was dry as bone, its ink faded into sepia veins. There were no titles, no indexes, only erratic Latin scrolls from hands that had long turned to dust. As he read, the flickering candlelight seemed to animate the horror documented there. A peasant exorcism gone awry in the early 12th century. A man, unnamed, had been taken by a force that resisted every rite. Not merely resisted, it defiled them. Crosses twisted. Sacred chants turned back on the priests' tongues. When the demon finally emerged, it didn't flee. It merged. The skin ruptured. Bones snapped. But the man didn't die. He changed. That night, Carlos learned that the creature he had spoken to was no myth. According to the records, it had once been human, devout, even a monk who had offered himself as a vessel in what was supposed to be a controlled possession, a secret Vatican experiment designed not to purge evil, but to bind it within holy flesh. The ritual, performed in secret somewhere in the borderlands of medieval Bavaria, was meant to create a weapon against infernal infestations. Instead, it created a being that could not be classified by heaven or hell. The fusion was not spiritual, but carnal. Ligaments tore only to regrow. Teeth elongated into fangs not made for words, but for war. It was the Church's first and last attempt at divine weaponization. Carlos could barely hold the document in his hands. The creature was not a cursed soul. It was a failed project. Every exorcism since, it seemed, had drawn from the fear of what happened then. Every rule of possession, every rite refined, was born from that horror. He turned to Allerjo, disbelief carving deep lines into his face. You knew. You knew this wasn't a demon in a man. It was something new. Allerjo nodded, jaw clenched. Not a possession, a rewriting. When God spoke man into being, it was breath. When hell spoke, it was marrow. He continued reading. Accounts from the following century described futile attempts to undo the fusion. Some called it exorcism. Others called it vivisection. They tried silver, fire, even relics from Jerusalem. But the being endured, not because it was immortal, but because it was indivisible. The demon had not taken residence in the man. It had become him. The text theorized that what made the being so dangerous was not strength but contradiction. It was a paradox of spirit and flesh, of damned and sanctified. A creature neither dead nor fully alive, a theological impossibility that mocked every known law of heaven. Carlos turned a fragile page and found a drawing etched in fading charcoal. The creature, muscular but hunched, fur like a black crown along its spine. Hands still vaguely human but twisted, like nature tried to correct them and failed. The eyes, disturbingly human, stared out of the sketch. Carlos's breath caught. He had seen those eyes, and they had begged. "Help me," the thing had said. That plea now echoed not in his ears but in his bones. This wasn't just a monster. It was a testimony and perhaps an accusation. What horrified Carlos more than the creature's form was the implication. If this was real, then what else had been hidden? He turned to Allerjo again, voice low but firm. "You kept all this buried. Why? Why not destroy it?" Allerjo didn't hesitate. "Because we couldn't. Holy fire did nothing. He heals from wounds that would scatter angels. And most importantly," he paused, "he remembers." Carlos stepped back. "Remembers?" Allerjo's eyes darkened. Every experiment, every priest who failed. Every scream. A body may forget the blade, but a soul remembers the hand that held it. Suddenly, it made sense. This wasn't a secret kept out of fear. It was shame. The Vatican didn't fear the beast because it was dangerous. They feared it because it was proof. Proof that the Church had once believed it could control the infernal. Proof that it had failed catastrophically. Carlos turned the final page, finding a confession written by a cardinal centuries ago. "We did not seek to fight demons. We sought to enslave them. We thought the soul could be divided, purified by will. We were wrong." Carlos ran his fingers through his hair, pacing the room. He had come here to study the development of early dogma, to learn how truth was shaped by history. But this was the forge where myth became flesh. The werewolf was not a legend misremembered. It was a failed sacrament, a theological Frankenstein. And worse, it wasn't alone. Several entries hinted at other trials, other vessels. None as stable, none that survived. But what if they had? He turned to Allerjo one last time. What happened to the rest? The man lowered his eyes. They burned the records, but I believe, he hesitated, I believe some were not destroyed, just lost. Carlos's throat dried. He could barely process what lay ahead. Why are you telling me this? Allerjo approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. Because you looked into its eyes and did not look away. Because you listened. And because, Padre, the Church may not survive another failure. Hell's greatest trick was not in rising. It was in whispering through robes embroidered in gold. Ex veritate maledicta, Vatican Black Index, Section D12. Carlos stood alone after Allerjo left, hands trembling over those ancient pages. Outside, the moon crept toward fullness. Deep below, behind rusted iron and sacred sigils, something shifted in the dark. Not wild, but aware, watching, waiting. And Carlos could feel it now. Not the fear, the connection. Carlos had barely slept. The candles in his room had long since burned to stumps, casting their last flickers against the curved stone walls of his Vatican quarters. But it wasn't the darkness that disturbed him. It was what he had heard. That voice, low and wounded, had echoed endlessly in his skull. Help me. Those two words had cracked the hardened shell of history, revealing not a beast, but something far more damning, a victim, a soul that had endured centuries of silence. Now, more than ever, Carlos needed answers, not from Allerjo nor the archives, but from the very creature the Church had tried to erase. Once I had a name, a brotherhood. I believed in salvation. Then I was offered as a gift to God. Or so they claimed. Carlos's throat tightened. The Church did this to you? The creature's voice cracked. They tried to make a weapon. Instead, they made a prison. In seeking to house the divine, they built a cage for the damned. It began to speak in fragments, its memory distorted by pain and time. Visions poured from its mouth like poison long kept sealed. It described rites performed in dim crypts, chants older than Latin. Men in red robes murmuring over its body as it trembled under sacred oils. But these were not exorcists. They were engineers of the soul, stitching sacred texts into flesh, hoping to overwrite sin with faith. I was conscious, it muttered, when the change began. I felt my bones betray me. Carlos swallowed, overcome by horror and awe. Why didn't they kill you? The creature's laughter was bitter. Because I survived, and survival to them was promise. Proof of concept. Carlos rose to his feet, turning briefly to Allerjo. Is this true? The older priest remained silent, lips pressed thin, eyes filled with centuries of guilt. The creature's voice dropped to a whisper. They kept me because they feared what they'd awakened. Not the demon, but the idea. That line struck Carlos deeper than any scripture ever had. He realized now that what lay before him wasn't a beast, but a mirror, one that reflected the Church's darkest ambition, to control damnation under the illusion of sanctity. Let no man speak the name of the beast, for in doing so, he utters the Church's shadow. Suddenly, the creature leaned forward, and something changed. Its tone softened. You heard me. No one has heard me for centuries. Carlos nodded. I want to understand. The creature blinked slowly, eyes shimmering. Then you must see what I see. A gust of wind, unnatural and scentless, swept through the corridor as its voice deepened, taking on a resonance that echoed far beyond the stone walls. Carlos staggered. Images, not visions, but memories, burst into his mind. A burning chapel, screams, metal binding flesh, a name being ripped from a man's lips and replaced with silence. He collapsed to his knees, sweat dripping, breath shallow. When the moment passed, the creature spoke again. This is what I am, a soul not damned, but rewritten. You call me werewolf. I am not beast. I am the failure they buried. Carlos rose slowly, eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Not fear, not pity, something older. Reverence, maybe. You still have your soul, he said, barely above a whisper. The creature nodded. They tried to kill it, but they could not. Carlos turned to Alerjo, voice shaking. He's not lost. He's still someone. Alerjo exhaled, his hands trembling. Then we are no longer speaking of containment. We're speaking of confession. For the first time, Carlos understood the true weight of what the church had buried. It wasn't just a being. It was a choice. An experiment that challenged the very definition of evil. And now it was a question no prayer could answer. If this creature still bore a soul, then who had truly sinned? The Vatican that made him, or the man who lived through it? He who walks the line between flesh and flame is not cursed, but chosen, by which God none can say. Carlos took one final look at the being before him. The cell that once looked like a cage now felt like a tomb, not for a monster, but for a mistake sanctified by time. The creature leaned back into the shadows, eyes never leaving Carlos's. If you walk away, it said, I remain a ghost. But if you stay, we both become something else. The young priest nodded slowly. Then I will stay. And as he sat down on the cold stone floor across from what had once been a man, Carlos felt the walls of doctrine crumble. Not in defiance, but in understanding. The truth was no longer history. It was alive. To speak with monsters is not to fall, but to remember who chained them. Carlos remained impassive as the heavy wooden door shut behind them, sealing the chamber where the creature lay imprisoned. The echo of its final words lingered in his ears, not merely a plea, but a declaration. He followed Alerjo down another corridor, one less decayed and far older. The walls were marked not with scriptures, but with symbols Carlos didn't recognize, neither Christian nor pagan, but a strange convergence of both. They reached a stone arch etched with a phrase in Latin, nearly faded, Ordo Umbrarum custod non lumina. The order of shadows keeps not the light. Alerjo took a deep breath before pushing open the next door. It's time you understand how deep this goes, he murmured. What Carlos found beyond would change him forever. The chamber resembled no part of the Vatican he had ever seen. Not a chapel, not a crypt, but something akin to a command post, though centuries old. Maps covered the walls, not of nations, but of ruins, forgotten monasteries, and remote chapels. Files sat in iron drawers labeled only with ciphers and dates. In the center of the room stood a relic display of broken chains, claws, and shattered relics encased in leaded glass. This is all that's left, Alerjo said softly. The Order of Shadows was founded during the plague, not to heal, but to hide. We were created to study the aberrations the church refused to acknowledge. Carlos blinked. You mean monsters? Alerjo nodded. No, failures. Abandoned experiments. The first was the werewolf, but it wasn't the last. Carlos walked slowly through the room, eyes darting between artifacts and parchments. One document caught his attention, a transcript in medieval Castilian describing a town in Galicia abandoned overnight after una criata de cuerpo had escaped from the monastery. Another page showed anatomical sketches of a being with 4 eyes and 3 lungs, annotated in what appeared to be Latin mixed with Enochian. Allerjo's voice was grave. We tried binding demons to bodies, spirits to relics. We wanted to weaponize the sacred against the profane. But every time, something went wrong. Vampires were the first failure. They lost their minds to thirst. But the werewolf? That was almost a success. Too much of a success. Not all blood was meant to carry the divine. But we forced it to. Carlos turned slowly. You mean there were others like him? Allerjo closed his eyes for a moment, as if confessing. Yes. Sites were built across the world, Africa, Eastern Europe, the jungles of Brazil, but they were shut down, buried, or destroyed after the subjects turned violent. Or worse, what's in Rome is the last, the only one we managed to contain without full annihilation. Carlos's heart pounded. And you've kept this from the church. Allerjo looked up, bitter amusement in his eyes. No, Padre, we are the church, or we were. The order reported directly to popes until it became an embarrassment. Then they buried us, just like our mistakes. The room seemed to darken as the weight of those centuries-old sins settled over them. Carlos studied one of the maps, a monastery in Ethiopia, burned in the 15th century, marked with the symbol of a hand surrounded by thorns. Another bore the date of a South American expedition with the words Nulinga scribbled across it. No language. He turned to Allerjo again. Are there any survivors? The man hesitated. We think some escaped before the last closures. Some experiments never returned to the church, and some were released. Cabinet labeled non-canonica. Inside were letters, hand-bound and sealed with black wax. He opened one. The handwriting was sharp, furious. It warned of a conscious metamorphosis, a subject that had stopped aging, begun fasting for decades at a time, and had started speaking in dead languages. A single phrase was underlined 3 times: he is no longer responding to exorcism. He is responding to prayer. Carlos felt the blood drain from his face. You weren't creating monsters, he whispered. You were trying to create saints. Allerjo didn't answer. He didn't need to. They will not canonize the beast, but they will fear him as a god. Carlos stared at the fractured relics behind the glass. He felt the full arc of what he had uncovered, a theology turned upon itself. The church, so desperate to fight the darkness, had dipped its hands into it, believing they could shape it into something holy. Instead, they created suffering. They created silence. And they created things that no dogma could contain. What do we do now? Carlos asked. Allerjo walked to a weathered console and lifted a small vial containing liquid darker than ink. We observe. We record. We prepare. Carlos clenched his jaw. You're still part of the order. Allerjo looked tired. I am the last. Outside, unseen by either of them, the torches in the lower corridor sputtered. A sigil carved into the stone above the creature's cell flickered, not with flame, but with shadow. And for the first time in centuries, the chains trembled, not from movement, but anticipation. Deep in the Vatican's bowels, something ancient stirred, not in anger, but in purpose. The Order of Shadows had hoped to erase its shame. But the truth was never buried. It was waiting. The blood of saints, the teeth of beasts, and the silence of the faithful. That is what forged the abyss. The tremor in the corridor was so slight that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone unfamiliar with the silence of the Vatican's lower levels. But Carlos had learned that even silence had weight. And when that weight shifted, something was wrong. The chains that had once held firm were moving, not violently, not in rage, but with purpose. The sigils etched in ancient stone, glowing faintly just hours before, now flickered like dying embers. Carlos descended into the darkness once more, torch in hand, while Allerjo followed, steps slow and shoulders heavy. They both knew containment was failing. Something had changed. Not the beast, the air. They reached the cell. The iron door was still shut, but the locks hung loose, as if the metal itself had surrendered. One of the carved symbols had crumbled, dust spreading like ash at Carlos's feet. Inside, the creature stood upright, not slouched in pain, not coiled in fury, but composed. It looked at them, and Carlos saw no madness in its eyes, only awareness. The priest whispered, "What's happening?" The creature's voice was calm. "The warding has faded, not by accident, not by decay, by design." Carlos turned sharply. "Who?" The creature tilted its head. "Divine will or a traitor in your order? Does it matter?" Behind them, Allerjo murmured a prayer under his breath, one older than Latin, trembling. Carlos stepped forward as the first chain dropped. No explosion, no roar, just the echo of iron against stone. The creature did not leap. It walked, each step deliberate, silent, like it had memorized this corridor in dreams. Allerjo drew a blade from within his robes, curved, ancient, blessed. The creature looked at him but made no move. "I am not here for vengeance," it said. "Not yet." But then the silence broke. Heavy doors slammed above. Boots, orders shouted in Latin. The Vatican had noticed. They were coming. Not to study, to erase. Carlos felt panic rise. "What do we do?" The creature turned to him. "Stand aside or fall with them. When the seal is broken, judgment does not scream. It whispers." The first guards appeared, clad in armor unfamiliar to any modern eye, forged not by soldiers, but by monks. Blades blessed, eyes cold. They moved without question, without fear. The order had prepared for this moment. The creature did not run. It met them, and it did not fight with rage. It dissected, one slash per man, one movement per breath, a dance of calculated retribution. Carlos watched in frozen awe as flesh met claw, but the creature never lost control. It avoided the kill when it could. Disarmed, only when cornered did it strike fatally, and always with precision. The corridor was painted in silence again. Blood spoke where prayers could not. Allerjo approached, blade lowered. "You aren't rampaging." The creature met his eyes. "I am cleansing." Carlos stepped between them. "You said you were made, forged in sin. What are you now?" The creature's expression shifted, as if tasting the word free. More footsteps echoed in the distance. The Vatican was mobilizing. Too late. The creature moved toward the corridor's end, the sealed passage that hadn't been opened in generations. A relic door guarded by rites long forgotten. Carlos hesitated. "If you go through there, what happens to us?" The creature turned slowly. "Nothing I take from you. Only what you chose to lose." Carlos blinked. "Faith." "No," the creature said. "Denial." Behind them, Allerjo touched the blood on the wall, tracing a symbol that looked both sacred and profane. "What is your purpose now?" The creature didn't look back to be seen. It opened the door without force. The mechanisms inside groaned, as if recognizing an air. Light, not golden, but red, spilled into the corridor, warm, thick. The door gave way, revealing a chamber no one alive had entered. Carlos saw symbols that pulsed like veins, walls that hummed with memory. The creature stepped inside, and the first to walk with the blood of the beast was not banished. He was crowned. Book of the Unnamed, Fragment 17, translated from Aramaic. Carlos and Allergo followed. The chamber was not of this world, or rather, not of the Vatican's. It bore the marks of another architecture, a theology not based on absolution, but transformation. Murals stretched across the wall, showing men turning into creatures, not with horror, but with reverence. A wolf crowned in starlight, a priest shedding his skin. At the chamber's center stood an altar, not for sacrifice, but for memory. The creature approached it slowly and placed a single claw upon its surface. The ground pulsed, the air shifted, and all the candles lit at once by breathless flame. Carlos dropped to his knees, overcome. Visions poured into his mind, popes whispering in dead languages, rituals never recorded, a council deeper than Nicaea. He saw men blessed and broken by power they called divine but did not understand, and then silence. He opened his eyes. The creature stood before him, eyes calm, voice soft. "They called me weapon, but I was always a witness. You are the first to listen." Allergo knelt beside him. "What do we do now?" The creature reached forward, pressing a claw to Carlos's forehead. "You remember. The curse is not the beast. It is the silence around it." Carlos awoke on the cold stone floor of the hidden chamber, breathless and soaked in sweat, though no fire had touched him. The air was thick with incense and iron, not burnt but ancient. All around him, the candles remained lit, unmoved by time. Across the chamber, the altar where the creature had placed its claw now pulsed faintly with a red hue, and above it, faint symbols shimmered along the dome. He sat up slowly. The silence was absolute. Allergo lay nearby, not wounded, but unconscious, as if he too had been caught in the visions that had flooded Carlos's mind. And the creature, it was gone. No sign of violence, no trail of blood, just absence. But something remained. Something had changed. Carlos stood, hands trembling as he approached the altar. The moment he touched it, he felt it again, that same pulse, now echoing within him. His breathing slowed. The pain in his limbs faded. Yet something else surfaced in its place. Clarity. He no longer felt tired. He no longer blinked. His body obeyed, but his senses no longer filtered the world like before. He could hear Allergo's heartbeat. He could hear the dust shifting across ancient stone. He whispered a prayer, not from fear, but out of instinct, and he heard it answered in a tongue he didn't know he knew. It wasn't Latin. It was older, forgotten. His mouth had spoken it, but it had not come from him. The chamber had changed. The murals on the wall were brighter now, as if the flames revealed new layers beneath the paint. Carlos approached one. It showed a man kneeling before a creature like the one they had seen, but not in chains, in reverence. And in the background, others watched, cardinals, perhaps, or something more. He blinked, but the image remained. Then a realization struck him. These were not prophecies. They were memories, not painted for faith, but recorded as warnings. History buried beneath dogma. He stepped back, and the vision that had plagued him since the creature's awakening returned. A council gathering in secret. Parchments burning, voices chanting over men whose skin cracked with light and fur. Not all that was divine bore wings. Some crawled first. Codex Bestialis, sealed at the Basilica of St. Agnes. Allergo stirred, groaning as he sat up. His eyes met Carlos's, and something passed between them, a quiet understanding that the line between priest and witness had now blurred. "Is it over?" Allergo asked, voice hoarse. Carlos shook his head. "No, it has only begun." Together, they ascended from the depths, moving through now empty corridors, no guards, no alarms. The Vatican above remained untouched, as if the violence and truth buried beneath it had never existed. As they emerged into the upper catacombs, Carlos caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of a cracked display case. His eyes, they no longer looked human. The color was there, but it glowed dimly, like embers beneath ash. Allergo saw it too but said nothing. The silence between them was no longer unease. It was packed. The creature was gone, yes, but it had not fled. It had moved forward, ascended perhaps, or passed into something else entirely. But its legacy, its mark, remained. Carlos felt it inside him, not a curse, not an infection, but an echo, a fragment. He didn't feel hunted. He felt chosen. Whether by design or accident, he could not say, but the Vatican could no longer pretend the past was buried. It had walked. It had spoken. And now it remembered. To carry the mark is not to fall. It is to walk between sins unspoken and truths unblessed. Carlos left Rome in silence, his departure unrecorded. No farewells, no notices. The scholarship that had brought him there became just another folder buried in bureaucracy. He walked instead, first to Florence, then through the forests of southern France. He did not hide, but he did not speak. Children sometimes stared at him in towns, not afraid, but curious. Dogs would not bark. Lamps flickered as he passed. And each night he dreamed, not of fire or fangs, but of languages older than thought, names he did not recognize until he whispered them aloud. And when he did, the earth answered, trees bent, candles burned blue. Once, in a village chapel, the crucifix cracked, not from heat, but from resonance.